Good evening, everyone. We shall be speaking in English, so if you need a translation, then please grab one of those headphones from the back. Gentleman at the back has the headphones. My name is Zoltán Pogátsa. I'm the editor of New Equality magazine, and today I have the pleasure of discussing the topic of the present and the future of the left with two prominent people who have a very long knowledge of the issue, which doesn't mean that they're old, it just means that they're very experienced and they have lots and lots of experience with the European left and the Hungarian left and German left. On my right is Ernst Hillebrand, who's the head of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung office here in Budapest. On my left, on your right, is László Andor, who is a professor of economics, former European commissioner, and he also has a lot of experience with both the Hungarian left and with the European left. And so, therefore, thank you for both of you for accepting to talk to us today. And therefore, I have asked them to start off the session today with a brief introduction. So we agreed with Ernst that László will be the first one speaking. Yes, that's the disadvantage of coming later. So you'll be the first one speaking, and I'd just like you to give a brief introductory talk to kick us off about where you see the left today, Hungarian left, European left, the left in general, and then Ernst will follow with a similar introduction. You can reflect upon each other, and then we move on towards the future, where you see the left headed in the next couple of decades, if that's okay. So, László, why don't you start us off?
Okay. Good evening. Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to discuss this interesting topic. The Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is, of course, a very important partner, playing a very important role in Hungary, but also Europe-wide, we can even say worldwide, as a center for promoting social democracy in all different forms and shapes, but also analyzing. And I think much of the analysis we have been doing in the recent years has also been done jointly and indeed producing advice. Of course, it's not taken for granted that politicians also follow the advice you generate, but these discussions, I believe, help clarifying the picture and perhaps also clarifying the agenda for the future as well. I have never been a great fan of the so-called pendulum theory, but I think that's where we would need to start to see what kind of swings European politics has produced in the last period. Why I would prefer starting with the European, because Germany and Hungary have their own specific political trajectories. Nevertheless, both form part of a European political space. And if we start from that and go back, for example, to the time of the great financial crisis, we have seen since that time several swings towards the left and the right. At the European level, I think it's important to mention that a kind of peak of European social democracy was observed at the end of the 1990s. It was the late 1990s when in the European Parliament the Social Democrats had historically the highest share, but also among the heads of state and government. Politicians leading national governments. We found the highest number of socialist or social democrats or center-left politicians in general. And ever since that time, what we have been witnessing is a kind of erosion of social democracy, which occasionally was corrected. And I will give you several examples. But also in many cases a setback was experienced only for subjective, partly for objective reasons.
And an example of a swing towards the center left was, for example, at the time of the Eurozone crisis, when you had a return to power of
the French socialists, the Danish social democrats, as part of a coalition, the Dutch social democrats, and in Italy, the PD, after the fall of Berlusconi, won election. Nevertheless, such a swing was not overwhelming, and very importantly, it left out the region we're in. East Central Europe also experienced a kind of peak of center-left politics. That was, interestingly, at the time of the accession to the European Union. When Hungary joined the European Union, a number of governments in this region, including Poland, including Czechia, if I'm not mistaken, even Slovenia and Lithuania, were led by social democratic politicians. And again, from that peak period, what we have experienced in all these countries, without an exception, a downward slope, a kind of erosion of support. So when we discuss the Hungarian situation, I'm all in favor of looking into the specific Hungarian details, what could have been done better, why exactly, and because of whom. Finding the responsible person is always very important. Why exactly the erosion in Hungary, together with a few other countries, turned out to be much more severe than in much of Western Europe, where social democracy, despite the erosion, have been stabilized. But it's very important also to put the Hungarian context, Hungarian developments into a regional context. Why is it the case that after a period of euphoria and great expectations that socialists and social democrats would deliver a lot to the societies of this region, there was a period of disappointment. I already mentioned the financial crisis. I believe the impact and the long-term consequences of the financial crisis are among these reasons, probably one of the main reasons why, after joining the European Union, the great expectation of convergence, upward convergence towards the West European standards of economic performance, but also social cohesion, didn't work out. I would say this is a very imbalanced record because, to some extent, we can speak about an economic convergence, especially in countries like Poland, since the time of EU accession, but this has not been coupled with what we call a social convergence, and I would say that this framing provides the key for understanding the regional trends as opposed to the Hungarians. The Hungarians has many other specificities as well. So when it comes to the title of the conversation, to talk about a vision, again we have to speak about a general European vision of social democrats, but we also need to ask specifically whether a new vision has been provided, developed in this region, specifically focusing on the conditions which prevail in this, the growth model, the social model.
When you say region, you mean Visegrad or Europe?
East Central Europe. When I say region, right, I was focusing on the countries that joined the European Union in 2004 and after, because Romania, Bulgaria, and Croatia joined after. But they share a model which is based on economic convergence, relying on cost competitiveness, and creating conditions for foreign direct investment, sometimes even at the expense of each other, in a kind of downward competition of the conditions. Very few countries managed to avoid this path. Originally, 10, 15, 20 years ago, we said, okay, Czechia and Slovenia Slovenia had a smarter transition in the 1990s. I think it was true. Poland subsequently had a smarter approach to using the EU funds for development. Estonia probably had a smarter approach to digitalization and public services. So you can point out a number of cases where specific countries had a smarter approach. Nevertheless, overall, I think we share this experience of either you can call it a maldevelopment or half development, when economically speaking you observe statistically a lot of income growth, but it doesn't necessarily benefit the wider population at large. It doesn't allow for, or it's not used for, providing or building a proper social safety net. It isn't used for creating decent industrial relations comparable to countries just a few miles away, Austria or Germany. So, in a way, you know, we witnessed, the older ones in the room, we witnessed 35 years ago the fall of the Iron Curtain, but the fall of the Iron Curtain and not even EU accession was sufficient so far for overcoming this imbalance, this asymmetry in the European Union, despite, let's admit this, despite the European Union itself providing a lot of support, but probably not enough. Now, how does it connect with the conditions of social democracy? I think it was social democrats, especially in this region, which basically connected the opportunity to join the European Union as delivering also the social model of the West European countries of 35 years ago, including in this room and upstairs. You know, there were many, many discussions about, you know, what kind of model Hungary should choose. Should it be the Austrian model, the Swedish model, whatever model, and when? What is the realistic time frame? What is the realistic time horizon? Is it going to be 5 years or 10 years when we reach the level of Austria? I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit, but just a little bit, because there were so many people enthusiastic and considering it, you know, absolutely within reach. That this convergence would be very, very fast. And in the 1990s, you know, it all started with an enormous mess, an enormous decline. If you remember the early 1990s, it was a complete disaster from the point of view of the economics and the social conditions. And then the social democratic program in the region was that we joined the European Union, we also joined NATO, and this is going to be the chance to restore the original dream. So it was a second chance for the transition. A lot of people called it, you know, the completion of the transition. And this completion, or a second chance, in a way also failed for wide range of the population. It's again different country by country, but let's be honest, from the point of view of the social cohesion, Hungary is one of the countries which fared the worst. So I, in a certain period, worked in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which produces an annual transition report, which also pays attention to inequality and the social condition. And it was observed that for a very, very long time, the living conditions of the lowest decile, the 10% of the population, remained well below, even 30 years after 1989. The living conditions of the lowest decile remained below the level of the late 1980s. Right? So there was an opportunity for many to take advantage of the new market society, but the social democratic program would be to benefit everybody. From a growing economy, to ensure that those people who work in decent conditions, can have decent wages. If productivity in the economy grows, wages will also go in a comparable level. But in East Central Europe, the region which we spoke about, in which Hungary is one example, not the best, the divergence started very early in the 1990s when the trade union movement was very severely weakened. There were various parliamentary measures also to ensure that the trade union movement remains weak and doesn't represent an obstacle to the foreign investors which would like to have what I sometimes call with the Spanish word the maquiladora. If somebody speaks Spanish, the maquiladora is a reference to the belt of in northern Mexico, where especially after the NAFTA, right? The free trade agreement was created between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and then a lot of companies came to this Mexican territory in order to take advantage of cheap labor and no trade unions, at the same time strong police, should there be a need to deal with the social unrest. So in a way, these tendencies obviously do not represent a fulfillment of any kind of social democratic agenda. So there is an element of the trickle down. We spoke with Polish colleagues who were in government 20 years ago, and they now openly say, yes, they believed in the trickle down. They believed in the economic growth lifting everybody, and the European enlargement not having a strong social dimension and not requiring countries to couple the economic growth with strong social policy resulted in a neglect of social policy, which manifests itself at the workplaces, but also outside the workplaces. One specificity which a lot of people do not pay attention, but in Central and Southeast Europe, this is obviously a massive question, the conditions of the Roma minority, the problems of the segregation, whether it is urban, but especially rural, right? Even in cities, the situation is somewhat better, but this is just one extreme example of not delivering proper social cohesion, while at the same time, the economic growth performance in many, many cases is not that bad. Is not that, especially comparing to the Eurozone, not that bad. So is there a kind of third promise, right? Because that would be a very interesting question. That the first promise was the transition itself, the regime change in 1989. You go to the market economy, everything is going to be fantastic. Of course, it did become. There was a neoliberal paradigm. There was a complete disintegration of the Comecon system, and that can only bring about a massive recession and an increase of the exploitation of the working people. And so the second promise was the EU accession, which, let's say, worked better. There was a lot of growth, but there was a massive crisis. We had last year a celebration, I think we can say a celebration of 20 years in the European Union, 20 years membership in the European Union. And I looked into a lot of numbers because I had to speak in all different occasions in the spring of last year. And I found some documentation that at the time of the negotiations, around 2000, it was, if you compare the Poles, the Czechs, and the Hungarians, it was the Hungarians who expected the most from the European Union. Something like 65% said it can only be good. For the Polish, it was 55%. For the Czechs, 45%. Right? The Czechs didn't expect much, right? The Czechs did say, okay, what does the European Union want from us? We already got rid of the Russians. Czechia is a market economy, very stable. You can't do much about it. So there was no hyper-optimism and definitely no illusions in Czechia about the EU accession. And on the other hand, since Hungary, if you compare these three, Hungary suffered the most in the 1990s. The expectations were very, very high at the time of the accession period. But what did Hungarians experience afterwards? An austerity policy in 2006, an austerity package even greater in 2009, and even under Fidesz in 2012, another round of the austerity. So, so this second promise in other countries worked better. But even if, let's say, it worked quite well, I think, in Poland. Even in Poland, social democracy came somewhat marginalized, although not annihilated, right? They also spent a season outside parliament, just like the Czechs, not us, not yet. But in terms of the functioning of the model, territorial and social cohesion, I think if you visit Poland, you find it better performing quite clearly. So, is there a possibility of of a third promise, which would be better followed and then deliver better? I would say maybe. I think it depends also on the actors here, right? In Hungary, in Poland, in Czechia, in Slovakia, in other neighboring countries, but very much depends on the European Union itself. And if you look at the European Union now, the EU, the European Commission is proposing to reduce for example, cohesion policy. Right? So, the Poles did very well for 20 years. Hungarians didn't do so well in 20 years out of cohesion policy. Romanians slowly improving. So the picture is already quite imbalanced. But if we look ahead, let's say the opportunities the European Union would provide to assist a convergent process, at least on the financial side, are probably diminishing. And that doesn't start well. On the other hand, of course, there is legislation. The European Union is not only a cash machine, it's to some extent a cash machine for some, but it's primarily not a cash machine. The cohesion also should fall under some kind of coordinated investment policy. But in the meantime, where money cannot help, the European Union is also supposed to offer a legislation. And more recently, the EU indeed extended its legislative activity to the question of wage policy, wage setting, and the minimum wage directive, which was adopted 3 years ago, has been found largely valid by the European Court of Justice. And this is a tool that's supposed to help in countries where the collective bargaining is too weak to ensure that the wage dynamics improve. There are many other issues where the EU would need to extend its policy competence to help a social democratic agenda in this region. Just mentioning one example, at the time of the corona crisis, even Ursula von der Leyen, who otherwise is a right-wing politician, spoke about the need for a health union, a European health union, that the European Union should coordinate, upgrade, and improve the capacity of the health systems, and also invest more in research and development in this field, and then a few years passed, the corona is forgotten, and Ursula von der Leyen already moved on to other issues, other priorities, as she calls it sometimes. Now she's deregulating a lot of things, and her attention is elsewhere. But this policy, in my view, to deliver on a health union, should be, by definition, a very important component of a social democratic agenda in this region, because the outflow of the health staff, whether it is medical doctors or nurses, has been so dramatic that something which in Britain and elsewhere has been a great achievement of social democracy, to have a national health service, is obviously impossible if you don't have the capacities for such. and it's partly because of the free movement in the European Union and continuous disinvestment from public services. So to improve collective bargaining, to improve wage dynamics, to improve public services, to improve social cohesion, anti-poverty action, so all this would need to form part, and all this is not entirely absent from the European agenda. The problem is that it's not sufficiently forceful. I don't think it will easily provide sufficient underpinning, but that's also the task of the social democratic family internationally, to build up these pillars of a convergent agenda, which I would say may and shall provide some boost to social democrats in this region in all different countries and shapes and forms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, László. Lots of thoughts there, but we'll turn now to Ernst, and then we'll have the discussion after both of them have spoken. Ernst, please.
Yeah, thank you, Zoltán, and thank you to you for being here and listening to us. I mean, it's a huge topic, the social democracy in Europe, and it's, of course, a very mixed picture. It depends on which part of Europe you look at, and you will get different impressions. I mean, László just described the situation of the social democracy of center-left in Central Eastern Europe, but which is kind of bleak, you have to admit, if you look at the election result and the representation in parliaments. Elsewhere in Europe, the picture is not so bleak, I would say. I mean, I would say that in Scandinavia, social democrats are doing quite well. I mean, they are leading parties in most of the country. They win elections, and they are still quite representative for the old social democratic class alliance between middle classes and working class people. It's not so good, but still okay, I think, in Southern Europe, Spain, Portugal, Italy. So results are quite okay, I think. Election polling is not so bad. It's a bit more dark when it comes to traditional Western Europe, France, Netherlands, Belgium, especially Germany, Austria. I think here the crisis is manifest. You can see it, and there are a lot of open questions for the movement. And of course, then in Central Eastern Europe, it's a specifically difficult situation. So, but it depends where you look at. And but why is it like this? Now, my approach is a different one than László's. I see, essentially, you can look at it at two levels. One is structural, and the other one is kind of short-term, actual current challenges for political movements. Now, I'm a great fan of the structural analysis, and this structural analysis basically has been formulated in the mid-2000s by a group of political scientists, various political scientists, and the basic assumption is the following one. Capitalism has evolved. We had a post-Second World War capitalist order which was based on strong nation states in which we were capable to organize some kind of class compromise between capital and labor through the redistributive welfare state system that we established in Western Europe during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Now, capitalism grew out of nation states, and we entered the phase of globalization. And globalization is another type of capitalism than the nation-state-based capitalism. And the basic structural conflicts that existed between the old-style capitalism within the nation-state, the distributional conflict between capital and labor that could be mitigated through welfare state systems, changed its character. The new basic cleavage in this globalized world is between those people who are in favor of globalization and those who still stick to the nation states as a kind of framework for organizing the economy, social systems, and the political systems. So we have the globalists, the cosmopolitans, and we have the nationalist, nation-state apologists, and the communitarisms of this world. I mean, this British publicist David Goodhart, he framed this much more tangible expression of the anywheres, which can be successful anywhere because they have the capital, the education, the cultural skills to be successful anywhere in the world. And in some words, people living in a specific place, depending on concrete social networks, depending on locally useful skills, and etc. And they are not in favor of globalization because they lose out, and you can see it clearly in distribution of wealth and income since the 1980s, that there is a new cleavage which divides our societies, and the welfare state systems are increasingly incapable to mitigate these conflicts. Now, I think this new cleavage between the anywheres and the somewheres has run, unfortunately, through the midst of these class alliance or social alliance of social democracy, which has been constituted during the 20th century as an alliance of educated, lower middle class people and the working classes. Now, globalization tends to divide this group. The educated middle classes tend to be in favor of globalization, internationalization, Europeization, whereas the working class people clinch to the nation state, where they have some democratic power in influencing politics. And they have split the class alliance between the blue-collar people and the white-collar people that has been at the core of the social democratic constellation of the 20th century. And that's what we see. Now, Social Democratic Party, during this development, they changed their character, whereas they have been before some kind of catch-all parties which have had constituencies in working class milieus and in lower middle class people. They have become essentially parties of urban academically trained middle classes, whereas the blue-collar people basically looked to other horizons. They were searching for new offers, people that were more representative of their interests, and a considerable part of them has been switching to national conservative right-wing populist parties, as in Hungary, as increasingly in Germany, where AfD is the strongest party among working people. So we have just a new constellation, and the social democratic parties have evolved during this process. They have changed ideologically and they have changed sociologically. They are now different parties, I would say, than they were 40 years ago. And this change in ideology and in sociology mostly has been resulting in this reduction of voting shares that we can see in Western Europe at the moment, because they are less representative in a certain sense socially than they used to be in the times of broader class alliance that were underpinning these parties. Now, that's a structural thing. Now, then the other thing, of course, is the short-term thing, where you expect parties to have answers to the current burning challenges your society or your people are faced with. And I think there we have in many countries of Western Europe a problem with the offer of politics that the social democratic parties are offering to people. The most urgent question, I think, that it's a make or break issue for social democracy is migration. As being true cosmopolitan parties, they tend to be in favor of relatively uncontrolled migration. Inside Europe, totally uncontrolled. From outside, well, more or less controlled. Now, this is not very attractive to increasing part of the population. You can look at opinion polls, and the picture is quite clear. And the only social democratic party that really manage well with the current challenges are the Scandinavian ones, which followed more or less the Danish example, which has established a much more stricter, much more assimilationist migration policy at the core of their political identity or offer in the last 10 years. And I think Sweden, Norway, they have all been, Iceland, they have been going slowly also in this direction and adopting much more restrictive approaches, and they are doing relatively well. In the other parts of Europe, the picture is different. I think this is one of the major reasons for the acceptance crisis that many of these parties are going through. The second, of course, is inflation and purchasing power and the current economic situation, which is increasingly marked by a relative low growth in Europe, an increasingly difficult competition situation of European enterprises, and most of the social democratic parties don't come up with a good solution to it. I mean, what do they offer? What are the politics they are proposing to people, how they want to change the situation? Honestly, I do not see much of this in the offers. I mean, the others also don't have a good answer. I mean, that's the reality, but still, I mean, social democrats do not have a convincing story to tell when it comes to these questions. And then we have increasingly a problem which might be even worse. I mean, if you look at opinion polls, most people in Western Europe think that the countries are heading in the wrong direction. Things are getting not better, but worse. And that's a general feeling if you look, if there's some kind of polling in this direction. And it's correlated, I think, to a delivery crisis of the public systems. What we see is a decaying infrastructure, education system that are functioning less good than they used to function in the past. You have what people feel an increasing sense of insecurity in the public sphere. Much of this may not be true when it comes to pure statistics, but as a general feeling, it's quite tangible. So there is a delivery problem of public services in large part of Europe. So, I mean, in French, you have this expression of the dessert administratif. So the state is going out of some areas. For people, it's no longer possible to reach anything of a public administrative services. It's become very difficult to get in touch with your state. I think that's, in Germany at least, it's a very strong feeling. So that we have a delivery crisis of the public systems. The head of the Green Party recently in an interview said, people are experiencing a state who is unable to hold the most simple promises. I think there's it's exaggerated, of course, but there's an element of truth in it, I think. And we have at FAS made an opinion poll last year before the election, and people were asked, one of the questions was, do you think that the politicians of this country have a plan for this country? And roughly 80% said no, they don't have the feeling that the politics in this country have a plan for this. I mean, this touches all political parties, but of course it also is part of how people see the center-left parties. They are increasingly, I think, seen as the managers of a status quo that no longer functions for an increasing part of the population. And there's no forward-looking vision, no positive vision where they want to develop the society. It's the only thing when we talk about the future is this kind of dystopian climate change narrative, which has become very strong in the center-left in the last 2 decades, so it's a decade. Now, of course, there's also a sign of hope. If you look at the Labour Party, you see that they are playing around with this idea of something like a progressive patriotism. I think that's a very good idea to regain the idea of patriotism, of national identity also for the left. If you look at the United States, you have this debate around Ezra Klein's book about abundance. So coming up with a positive narrative about the potentials of a technology-led economy that brings about great wealth and material well-being also for people, that has a great potential to make people's life better. We also had an essentially very negative view, I think, about technology in the last decades. And this is not very promising, I would say. So I think you see how this political movement is evolving. They are looking around, they are casting around for ideas. Scandinavia is quite interesting in this respect. But at the moment still, I don't see something like a very convincing social democratic vision for our societies. And this most probably is one of the additional reasons why the electoral results are not as good as they used to be. So that's my interpretation.
Okay, thank you very much, Ernst. Lots of thoughts here too. I propose that we start off by two of you reflecting upon each other, and then we'll take it further.
I think Ernst was mentioning something at the end, which I think is extremely interesting, which is an observation about some kind of new beginning. And after this crisis of what I would call the neoliberal center-left, what kind of new direction is being taken? Neoliberal, I think we can apply as an adjective for this period, mainly the 1990s, and afterwards, following the 1990s, maybe one or two additional decades, which was especially inseminated by the convergence between the British Labour and the American Democrats, which obviously was also about dropping the name social democracy, replacing everything with just progressive in very general, progressive being the new coalition of the center-left, and moving towards neoliberalism, the neoliberal status quo in economics. Public services, as we found, under-deliver in many countries, not least because of a lot of disinvestment from public services and the opening of the public services to public-private partnerships, allowing a lot of private companies to take out profits while at the same time insufficient investment is taking place. But also, I think it's useful to speak about a neoliberal period of social democracy. If we follow the political scientist Herbert Kitschelt. Kitschelt is very interesting, and he established a big school on the basis of distinguishing between axis 1 and axis 2. In the social democratic profile. Axis 1 is the conventional, which is focusing the question of the economics, the socio-economic identity, basically to ensure that the public plays a strong role in driving investment, and then you ensure that distribution is developed fairly in society. You don't allow the rise of inequality, and through public intervention you can control inequality, unemployment, but also poverty, and maintain social cohesion. So this is the axis 1. But axis 2 developed pretty much after the 1960s, the so-called cultural dimension. When we haven't mentioned yet feminism, for example, the question of gender equality, racial equality, and a greater freedom of the lifestyle. And in a way, it has become a question, especially in this neoliberal period, what is the balance between the focus on axis 1 and axis 2? Have we given up the economic and social focus in favor of axis 2, to be progressive in the cultural domain, but deforcing the actions on economic and social policies? So now I think this Kitschelt school is quite influential in kind of assessing, describing the problem in this way, and informs some of the new initiatives which try to rebalance. I very much agree that Denmark is a very interesting case. We had as FEPS an event in Copenhagen recently, and had the opportunity to see Mette Frederiksen as well. And as she explains, they were moving towards the left on economic and social issues to reconfirm, for example, on pension system, the importance of fairness to be applied in the field of pensions and
solidarity between the generations. But at the same time, indeed, they need to appeal to the concerns of the society on the ground of the migration. That's, of course, a big debate. Although I think it's
a matter of discussion to what extent historically social democracy was ready to open migration. I also spoke recently with Gösta Esping Andersen, very famous sociologist who described the welfare states, different worlds of welfare capitalism in the 20th century, and he opined that in Northern Europe, feminism and the integration of women in the labor market was so advanced because they didn't want migration, right? They were very hesitant to open up, like Germany. Germany opened up very early to guest workers, especially from Turkey in the 1960s and afterwards. The Swedes were hesitant to go to the same direction, and also the Danes. It's interesting to compare the center-left, center-right, or more broadly, left and right positions on migration, because even inside the European Union, it has been conventionally the left, which was skeptical about the free movement of workers. Trade unions have always been concerned, even in forms which is the posted worker. The posted worker doesn't even migrate to the other country. This posted worker just sent from one country to another temporarily to perform some job. And the unions and the social democratic parties were scrutinizing this for years and years and years and years and years in order to ensure that the European regulation does not allow an incentive to develop out of the discrimination, right? If you are allowed to discriminate the migrant worker, then it becomes an incentive to business to employ the migrant worker as compared to the domestic ones. So the difference I see between the left and the right approach, that the left insisted on no discrimination, which also means consequently no incentive for employing migrant workers, while the right-wing politics, also supported by big business, was always open to discrimination and wanted to stimulate migration in order to undermine the strong trade unions and create a second tier of the labor market in all different countries. Wir schaffen das did not come from a social democratic politician. It came from a right-wing politician, Angela Merkel, and of course it was explained in a certain context. And at the same time, what the progressives, social democrats are trying to do to ensure that the European Union becomes a solidarity collective if there is extraordinary pressure on one country or another because of migration waves, enormous numbers of refugees. The European Union collectively can provide support and deal with such challenges. But I think it's true that the financial crisis basically undermined and turn the page on this neoliberal period of the social democracy in different regions. So not only in East, in East definitely it was a killer, but again, socialists were given a chance. The French election in 2012 is something everybody would need to study because the socialists were given the chance to deal with the financial crisis, and François Hollande won the election with the promise of ending austerity and restoring economic growth and delivering to workers and the population at large, and why exactly this did not happen or turned out to be insufficient, not only in France but also in some other countries, is one of the explanations why the subsequent setback became just so severe.
Thank you. Ernst?
Yeah, difficult. I'm absolutely not convinced that this neoliberal period of center-left is over. Why? Because I think neoliberalism is at the heart of the cosmopolitan and European ideology of the center-left. If you look at it, what is the basic idea of neoliberalism? I mean, I'm simplifying extremely. The argument is to say there should be no limits to the mobility of capital, labor, and goods. States should have limited power to influence on this, and the market should regulate it as large as possible. Now, this openness, this borderlessness, is of course at the heart of the European project. Free flow of labor, free flow of capital, free flow of goods. It's basically a neoliberal project which is undermining the regulatory and administrative capacities and powers of the European nation states, transfers decision-making power to supranational institutions which are hardly affected by democratic votes. It's very difficult to have influence on them. And the whole approach to globalization, of course, is a neoliberal idea. Production has to go where it's most effective. And that's the idea of producing in China and Mexico, and not in Germany or Hungary. And I think the neoliberalism at the core of this cosmopolitan anywhere worldview. And so I don't see it at all. I mean, even if the outright neoliberal enthusiasm of the Blair, Schröder, whatsoever, period of social democracy is over, I think the whole project of the globalist ideology, which still is very at the core of the center-left movement in the United States, in the West, let's put it like this, is basically neoliberal. And so I don't see it that we've overcome this. It's still existing, and it's still making the offer the center-left has to people who count on the nation state to defend their interests, to give them a voice through their capacities as voters in national elections. They don't trust this social democratic cosmopolitan center-left approach. And I think if we don't redefine our stand toward this cosmopolitan European integrationist approach, we will not be able to win these people back.
Okay, thank you. I would have a lot to say, but I will try to refrain myself and stay in the role of the moderator. But I would like to open up the floor at this point to people in the audience. If you have any thoughts, comments, questions on anything we've said so far.
New era started with, so I do feel that a new era started, which with Trump as a president in the United States, and a little bit earlier, because this new era started with demolishment of the European and Russia collaboration and the war in Ukraine, and this will change the rule if we can't stop it. And the new era has also started in that way that, let's say, the whole economics rule had been changed with that Japan and Europe had to pay duties in exporting, which is totally different, which was years ago. And my feeling that I would be more glad that this would be a temporary period of time, but I am not sure that it will. So I don't know how to react. Thanks.
Okay, any other questions? Come.
Szóval nem biztos, hogy kérdés, ezt is magyarul fogom föltenni, mindenkitől elnézést. Nagyon érdekes volt, amit Ernst mondott, hogy a nyugat-európai mainstream baloldal szívében van a neoliberalizmus, és hogy szerintem is így van, és hogy ez elég nagy probléma. Tehát nem ismerjük fel, hogy amit újra és újra teszünk, az folyamatosan kudarchoz vezet, akkor valahogy majd máshogy kellene csinálni. És lehet, hogy vissza kellene nyúlni ahhoz, amit ezelőtt 30 vagy 40 évvel ezelőtt mondtunk és csináltunk, és azt komolyan is kellene gondolni. És most belemehetnénk komolyabban is a magyar helyzetben, meg beszélhetnénk személyekről is, de szerintem ez most nem lenne célra vezető. De azt gondolom, hogy így a magyar helyzetet nézve, hogy valahogy mindig külső tényezők, meg külső nyomás hatására változik valami a bal oldalon, és szerintem ez most egy nagyon nagy tanulópénz, ami most fog következni a jövő évben. És lehet, hogy erre tekinthetünk lehetőségként is, de nagyon fájdalmas lesz sokunk számára. De talán ez egy lehetőség arra, hogy egyébként amit nagyon-nagyon sok okos ember, aki körülöttünk van most is, és nagyon sok mindent elmondott, és vagy nem olvasták el a vezetők, vagy a döntéshozók, vagy nem fogadták meg, akkor ezt most újra gondoljuk, megfogadjuk a tanácsokat, és azt szerint is cselekedjünk. Szóval szerintem a magyar ellenzéki 15 év ellenzéki oldalában ez csomó olyan szereplő van, aki egyébként nagyjából ugyanazt gondolja a világról, ugyanúgy baloldali, de több pártban volt, de valahogy a pártpolitikai mezőben való szembenállás elvitte az együttműködés lehetőségét, és ez a jövő évi egyrészt esély a győzelemre, de azt a győzelmet azt nem mi fogjuk aratni már, mint a baloldal, hanem egy magát jobb középnek gondoló vagy valló, egyébként az Európai Néppárt rendes tagja fogja nyerni, ha nyer egyébként. De számunkra ott lesz a lehetőség arra, hogy újra gondoljuk magunkat, és egyébként elvégezzük azt az apró munkát, amit mindenkinek meg kellett volna tennie, de nagyon kevesen tették meg, és itt gondolok arra, hogy vajon hány ember tagja a szakszervezetnek, vajon hány ember szervez egyébként a munkahelyén szakszervezetet, hány ember csinál bármiféle politikai aktivizmust, ami nem abban merül ki, hogy egy civil szervezetnek pénzt adományoz, és elmegy mondjuk ételt osztani, mert ezek nagyon fontosak a szívünknek és a lelkünknek, de hogy ettől még a politikai apró munka nem lesz elvégezve. Tehát én azt gondolom, hogy lehetőség adott, és én pár évvel ezelőtt úgy fogalmaztam meg, talán pont abban a nyári táborban, amit a Fest szervezett, és ahol nagyon sokakkal megismerkedtünk, hogy én azt nem értem, hogy az én pártom, az MSZP, az miért nem akar fehér 50-es férfiakat képviselni. Mert hogy folyamatosan arról beszélünk, hogy kiket akarunk képviselni, de hogy valahogy ez a kategória soha nincs benne. És egyébként ez a kategória politikailag szerintem nagyon-nagyon aktív, és jól teszi, hogy aktív, és a jobb oldal, meg a populista jobb oldal, meg csak nekik beszél. Tehát mi lenne, hogyha végre elkezdenénk beszélni, nem csak marginális csoportokhoz, hanem valódi érdekképviseletet hajtanánk végre szakszervezeti szinten és politikailag is.
Köszönöm. Anyone else? Okay, we do have two questions. Whichever you feel like answering.
So on the first one, I mean, really difficult. I mean, I think it's temporary because everything is temporary. But that's the optimistic note on it. But I would rather agree. I mean, but in that sense that we are seeing a new constellation. I mean, just reading a book from Branko Michalovic on, how does he call it? National liberal capitalism, some kind of overcoming globalization and reorganizing capitalism within, in a stronger sense, in the sphere of nation states and national economies, a movement that's starting in the United States, but according, if I get it right, will also be expanding in the Western world generally. And maybe he's right. I mean, what I would rather interpret the United States development as a kind of retreat from globalization in a certain sense, because globalization has turned out for parts of the American economy as being a losing game. And the same will happen to Germany, of course. I mean, we are always extremely optimistic. I remember in the early 2000s, there was an interview with a German industrial manager talking about China, and he was saying, yeah, of course China will be the production side of the world, the Fabrik, but it's Germany that builds it. And yeah, it's true, we build it, but now they are producing, and now they're becoming a massive competitor for the European industry. And so I think that pure economic rationality will force also Western Europe into some kind of retreat from this globalistic approach to the economy. And me personally, I rather think that's a good thing to happen. But of course, I'm not sure when saying this. It could also be a bad thing. But we're going to see.
I'm not sure I've understood everything, but I think the question, of course, today is the change of the behavior of the United States of America, and especially how they behave towards Europe, which I think is not without any kind of pre-warning, because the Trump presidency first time between 2017 and 21 was already a first chapter, a kind of overture for what we are experiencing now, but also the change of the United Kingdom. We shouldn't forget that the US and the UK are very closely connected in terms of politics and political economy, especially, and they both represented, and the US now represent very clearly, a kind of neoliberal challenge towards the European Union. I think one proof that the EU is not a neoliberal structure is that the neoliberals actually hate it. The British were driven out of the European Union by neoliberals, who thought that this European Union is an over-regulated system. There is too much state intervention. They cannot control and deregulate their economy. Those people who promoted the Brexit spoke about a bonfire of the regulations, including the workers' rights in the United Kingdom. So the EU was not simply built to deliver for freedoms, eliminate borders. The EU was also built to deliver a social dimension of the European Union. We have social legislation, we have cohesion policy, and even after the great financial crisis, a pillar of the social rights was established, and what I already mentioned before, the minimum wage legislation. The minimum wage legislation at the EU was obviously only possible because previously Germany had introduced a national minimum wage. But why did the German Social Democrats introduce a minimum wage? Because they are not neoliberal. And they already raised it once more when the new government entered under Olaf Scholz when he was the chancellor. So I think the challenge is indeed from the side of the American conservatives to undermine the integrity of the European single market. Why? Because the United States has reached its limits as a global hegemon. Indeed, they created the rules in the 1990s of the neoliberal globalization. They brought China into the World Trade Organization, and subsequently they brought Russia into the World Trade Organization as well. But the US and the UK just continue to accumulate deficits, which at the end of the day threatens the solvency of these two countries. So now they have to use new tools in order to preserve their own solvency, and they reorganize how the world functions. The problem is that, as compared to previous times, the US dollar cannot be devalued anymore. So the US economy is not competitive. Normally, if an economy is not competitive, you solve it through a devaluation of the national currency. But because the US dollar is a global key currency, people just want to hold it because it's a means of exchange also outside the United States. There's always a lot of demand for it. It's very difficult. It's almost impossible to devalue, right? Hungary devalued at the time of the great financial crisis because that was the way of the correction, also demanded by the International Monetary Fund. Germany never had to devalue because they always had to revalue as compared to other countries, because the productivity was growing faster than in the countries with which they were trading. Now there is a new situation, of course, but this is why the US only can operate through tariffs. So they reorganize the international trade. The tariff system is also a means of blackmail in the hands of Donald Trump. They try to blackmail also the European leadership to dilute, if not eliminate, the legislation which basically creates and maintains the integrity of the European single market. The single market basically means that the Europeans themselves, according to their own values, have the right to control the single market and the access to the single markets. The Americans now demand an elimination of these regulations, especially before their companies, in order to ensure that the biggest companies, which are largely connected with the platform economy, the digitalization, and using artificial intelligence already in all different forms. So they want to open up this European space, just like they did in Great Britain in the 1980s, right? Thatcherism in the 80s. Zoltán had an excellent podcast about Margaret Thatcher recently. But the 1980s was also about this kind of big bang in the United Kingdom, which opened up the UK, especially to the American enterprises, and also it resulted in fostering closer collaboration in foreign and security policy between the UK and the US. So now all this rhetoric which we have been witnessing in the last 1 year, and what is also now put on paper in the new national security strategy, is pointing to this direction. The first round didn't go very well. We saw the surrender by Ursula von der Leyen in the summer when she went to Scotland, and now we will see whether these shocks would electrify the European politicians. And in the last few days, what we saw, a lot of European politicians started to tweet European flags. That's already something. that you put out the European flag. This is the flag of freedom. This is what represents for us democracy, etc. This is already a good start, right? To start using the symbolism. But of course, just putting out the European flag doesn't solve the problem. It just like just putting out the Ukrainian flag doesn't solve the problem in Ukraine, because it doesn't influence the battlefield reality. So just putting out on social media the European flag, it's not going to turn around this process. The EU countries, especially the major countries, would need to get their act together and stop this blackmail. And insist on the strategic autonomy and the sovereignty of the European Union.
I love the way that the people who do most for European integration are people like Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump or similar figures. But I feel like we didn't answer Ferenc's question. I'd like you to say a few words about when he said, whom does the Social Democratic Party represent? I really like that provocation about whether Social Democrats still represent the average Joe. Well, what he said was a 50-year-old white guy, but to broaden it, I mean, there's obviously some point in. I mean, some people would say they don't represent the minorities either, but then this broadens up into a debate. So if minorities say they fail to represent them, and then the mainstream says they fail to represent them, then who the hell did social democracy represent in the last 20, 30 years, or who are they representing now?
We tried to do some kind of empirical approach to the question 5, 6 years ago, when we were asking, in a comparison between 20 European countries or 18 or 15, people how they feel represented by social democratic parties. And basically working class people, average people, normal people, they don't feel represented. When you ask them, do you think the Social Democratic Party in your country stands for people like you? Working class people clearly say, in a majority, no. Not everybody, but of course a majority says no. So I think, in the United Kingdom, there has always been this nice expression of the ordinary people, the hardworking people who play by the rules. Most of these hardworking people who play by the rules, unfortunately, currently don't feel represented by center-left parties, I'm afraid. I mean, now you would have to come up with a series of political proposals, I think, to change this situation. It's also a social cultural question. I think these kind of overemphasis on some aspects of identity politics weren't useful, which
politika. László utalt erre, túl hangsúlyozása a klímaváltozásnak. Ugye nem akkor használták, amikor a küszködő emberekkel való, tehát nem kapcsolódtak velük vagy hozzájuk, úgyhogy
would have to touch on various fields of politics to reconnect with this average Joe, as Zoltán has called it.
One point to supplement this. Indeed, I think social democracy doesn't work if it doesn't rest on social movements. And the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries developed all different types of social movements, but conventionally in Western Europe and in Central Europe, the critical one was the labor movement, right? The fight of the working people for better working conditions and better life. In many countries, for a very long time, it was almost identical with the social democratic movement. One was at the workplace, the other one was in the parliament, and the newspapers, because sometimes the newspaper was, the party was banned by Bismarck, but they printed the newspaper in Zurich and tried to disseminate wherever it was possible. But in Northern Europe, and then indeed this example was highlighted by Ernst too, if you look at Sweden, if you look at Norway, the Social Democratic parties are strong. In Norway, they are in government. Maybe next year they come back in Sweden. Why? Because this very, very strong relationship between the trade union movement and the Social Democratic Party is upheld. It's maintained. In other countries, the trade union movement is more diverse, but we shouldn't see the Social Democrats as the only one. The feminist movement originally started with the liberals, but I think it became also very, very closely knit. If you look at Spain, it represents a much greater part of the identity of the socialists than in many other countries. This also has an explanation. In the Franco regime, what the Franco regime did to women, babies, and families was absolutely horrendous, and that also gave rise to this very, very strong tendency and gave an opportunity for the socialists to integrate a feminist cause in their politics, and peace movements. Very difficult. But this is also a crucial question. Do we allow a militarization of the society and international relation, or somehow rely on the desire of the normal people to live in peace? The student movements, I think, very important. Very often, historically, I'm stressing historically, the students' movements were very strong. Even when I was going to a British university, in British universities, it was just very, very straightforward to have a left ideology and connect with one of the many opportunities to engage in left-wing politics. Now, that's probably a layer where in many countries the socialists are almost extinct. And this is something to think about. The cooperative movement, because we shouldn't just fixate on the urban area, right? Also the rural question, but the cooperative movement is also very difficult in this part of the year. The Italians and the French, where there are many, many cooperatives, and Spain, they always wonder, oh, why in Eastern Europe? The cooperative movement has been left behind, etc. It always requires a bit of an explanation, but theoretically a lot of things could exist and would exist. I'm just saying that in so many ways, if there are no social movements, then social democratic parties have less social base to rely on, because liberal and right-wing parties can always rely on the support of business, big business, semi-big business, enormous business, SMEs. So there's much less room for the socialist parties to rely on the support of business as opposed to connecting with existing social movements to the extent movements exist. And this is one of the problems in my view. It's not simply that socialist parties weakened in the opinion polls. At the end of the day, opinion polls matter every 4 years when we had the election. But social movements would need to matter every day or every week, like joining the trade union or participating in other social or political movements for improving the conditions. It's supposed to be part of the lifestyle for a civil society, but this has also weakened tremendously. Why exactly? I'm not an expert of that.
Thank you. We are slowly running out of time, but if any of you in the audience have gone.
Yes, good evening. David Klotz is my name. I wanted to ask a question very specifically about the social democratic ideas in Hungary. We are currently seeing that TISA party is on the rise and swallowing all the former opposition parties. Now, TISA party is not really a classic social democratic party, actually not at all, but very opposing to Fidesz still. What do you think
will the social democratic values prevail in Hungary, or are they now more or less like declining totally, now that TISA is swallowing all the other opposition parties like MSZP and probably also Két Farkú Kutya part, who are maybe still the most leftist that we could get in the parliament?
I would differentiate. I think indeed there has been a big effect on the pre-existing opposition after the rise of the TISA party, but I think there are different categories, because I think the biggest blow, and very quickly in 2024 was last year, right? 24, when it all started, was on the centrist parties, Momentum and the Két Farkú Kutya, as you also pointed to this. And maybe for a while it was still a question what's going to happen with the center-left parties. And I would say that what we are witnessing in Hungary is pretty much a manifestation of despair. That after 4 elections, which were really dramatically and horribly lost to Viktor Orbán, a lot of people are simply desperate. So I think we need to understand this very special social psychology which prevails in this country. This is a split country from the point of view of the political opinion, because we shouldn't forget that Mr. Orbán still has a lot of supporters. And I don't know whether it's rock solid or not, but he does have his cap, probably not intact, right? And it's quite clear that they themselves are not as confident as before regarding the possible election outcome. On the other hand, you have a lot of people who either never voted Fidesz or changed their mind and regretted on many occasions before. And are desperate for change, but these people who want to vote for somebody non-Orbán have tried all different configurations before, right? In 2010, they tried parties like the Socialist Party, the Jobbik, and the Green Party. There was a Green Party LMP, and then it split, and the Socialist Party split. So in 2014, there was another configuration of these parties, and always new parties emerged in order to fragment the opposition further. And in 2018, there was another front face, another configuration, and another set of new parties in order to fragment further. So in a way, you have to understand the opposition voter, whether they are left, right, center, that they want to try something new. And this is obviously a new idea, to just support one person, wherever this person comes from. And it's quite obvious that he comes from Fidesz. For a very long time, he had no problem with Fidesz until the EU money stopped. Right? So a lot of people who now lead TISA or go behind TISA became upset with Fidesz after 2022, when the European Union stopped transferring the investment funds, and Hungary experienced a setback in terms of investment and growth. It's very, very weak, especially in comparison to the regional neighbors. And if you look at the election outcomes of last year, it's very important to see that it's not only European Parliament elections took place, but also municipal elections. And there were many, many different beneficiaries, right? TISA was one beneficiary, but many other opposition countries in different locations, especially medium towns, from Paks to Ajka, were beneficiaries of this, because in local different conditions, different people were trusted to represent the alternative to the prevailing power structure. So I think we expect whatever we expect. I think it's still a very open race. So I'm not an opinion pollster, but my feeling is that this is still pretty much a very open situation, and we don't know what comes after, right? So I think we need to assume that, just like in many other countries, in Hungary also there will be a need for the representation of progressive ideas. There will be a need for representation of progressive politics, and at the same time, right now, a lot of people also believe that the need is for a systemic change, rather than simply choosing between right and left.
If Otto will allow me, one last question, Vicky, and then we finish.
Thank you. So you said a lot of interesting things, but I felt like a little bit that it's always talking about the past or talking about like what is the situation right now. And the title of the event was like, is there a future for social democracy? So I feel like that question has not really been answered yet. And I want to share some thoughts about that as well. So like I originally come from, I worked for a trade union movement quite for a long time here in Hungary. And back then when I started like 17 years ago, we already talked about the need of renewal. And that renewal still didn't really happen. And I think this is the main problem also with the social democratic movement here in Hungary as well, that this renewal didn't really happen, and we failed to do the basic work of organizing on the grassroots level. This is the same for unions and parties, I think, as well. And until we don't do that, we don't go back to the little communities and really start to care about their problems at the local level, we cannot build up a stronger system, I think. So I don't know if you agree. And also with the European level things, László mentioned the European pillar of social rights. And I remember I was working on the European level as well when that was adopted. We organized conferences about it. We was quite enthusiastic about the 20 pillars, 20 different principles. But still, a lot of them were not really put in practice till now, or even if they were, then when it comes to the national level, even if it's implemented, and sometimes it's not, then we see that the national governments communicate it as their own deed, let's say, and if something is wrong and or bad things coming from the union, then they are communicating it as, nah, we are saving you from this and stuff like that. So it's also that we don't really have a good PR and marketing communication, I must say, and we should really try to reframe a lot of things, because when you talked a lot about now the TISA party, I really feel like that they have a very good marketing team behind, and this is a very well-developed system of how to build up a kind of a celebrity or a social media influencer. And if that guy really can become a prime minister after this, then I'm not saying to give up our ethics or our thoughts about what is good and bad, but really to try to also communicate it to average people so that they understand it. That is worth a try. Thank you.
Well, I totally agree. I mean, we don't have a good narrative or story to tell about the future. I mean, basically, if you look at the history of the workers' movement, it was a story about empowerment of ordinary people, weak people, cultural empowerment, economic empowerment, and political empowerment. Do we have any story about this today as a political movement? I don't see it. None of these respects. So I think that there's a real absence of forward-looking political, let's call it philosophical thinking about the way we want to shape our societies in the future, in the sense that people can have a better control over their lives. This does not play any role in any of the social democratic movements. I personally love this dimension. And then, of course, there are other questions. I mean, we are facing what some very intelligent people are calling a second industrial revolution. The artificial intelligence and digitalization will completely change the way we produce. And do we have anything of a long-term reasoning about the effects of digitalization, roboterization, artificial intelligence on our societies? I don't see it. Absolutely nothing in the discussion of the social democratic parties. And I honestly neither see a very structured and intelligent approach to these changing winds of the global economy we have been also talking about. I mean, what we are seeing is the rise of the Pacific Basin as the core of the world economy. Europe is losing influence. Europe is losing competitiveness. Europe is lagging in a variety of key technologies of the 21st centuries. Do I see any social democratic structured reasoning about these things? Honestly, not. I mean, always some kind of discussion, but it's not really a systemic, structured approach to this. The only thing we are offering as a vision of the future is that we will use less energy because it's bad for the climate to use energy somehow. That's a dystopian perspective of a climate catastrophe and crisis, which is the only future narrative, basically, that we have been having for the last 20 or 15 years. So I think this is not an attractive story to tell people, especially to young people. They want to have some kind of a positive idea about the life they have in front of them. And I really deeply regretted being part of one of those great European social democratic institution which has the capacity to, we have the people to think and we have the money to think, but also we as FAS, we were not able to put forward something like a coherent narrative on the key challenges and a positive perspective for our societies. And if we don't get this thing done, I think we will stay quite unattractive for many people as political organizations.
Last words.
Yes, I think the consequence of what Ernst was saying, that if the Social Democrats are not sufficiently attractive here, there and everywhere, is that the main political battlefield shifts between the center-right and the far-right. So this is what we are witnessing in many countries in the region. Even if socialists might be occasionally in the government like Poland, the main rivalry is between the center-right and the far-right. This is not the case in Hungary for the time being, but in the eastern part of Germany also, and in quite a few other countries, Czechia, we wouldn't have thought this becomes the case. So there are some other countries also with governments of the center-right and the far-right, but still with strong center-left parties like in Sweden or Italy, which might turn the situation around in the next round. But I would like to reinforce the point made by Ernst on technology. I recently looked into, because YouTube allows you, can we say these names? I mean, so on social media, where you can access old videos. I have seen a lot of recordings of the former Prime Minister of Britain, Harold Wilson, and he was the Prime Minister who won the most elections for the Labour Party. He won 4 times, and when he wanted to define his mission when he took over first time, he spoke about the white heat of the technology, and that was basically a modernist entry after the failure of the Conservatives, who in the 50s, still under Anthony Eden, you remember the Suez Crisis, were trying these all different types of imperialism around the world and try to reboot this old-fashioned approach to global affairs. So there are great traditions of a technology-focused economic policy, innovation. I think in our time, the personality who represents this most is Mariana Mazzucato. I think she's a very famous, well-known author, and she not only explains that technological innovation is important, but she also explains that even in the United States, public investment and government policy plays a massive role in creating the technological innovations. So in FEPS in Brussels, we also have a number of projects and conferences also on artificial intelligence. And indeed, the point is that even if there are some side effects of the technological development all the time, like the platform work if it results in excessive flexibilization, but you shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. There is always a baby which delivers with the new technology the opportunity to improve not only productivity in the economy, but also the quality of life, giving people more choices. I also would agree that on issues like climate, there is a need for correction. Even if the intention sometimes is good and the goals are good, you also have to match it with the right policy or the right solution. If it was not the right, you need to correct. The final point is to highlight the case which is not far away from us, which is Austria, when we have witnessed big debates, internal divide, before the latest leadership election of the Social Democratic Party, but they managed to reunite. So you can have all different type of tendencies in a party and diverge on opinion. In fact, the Austrian Social Democrats, they were split into three equals. One which was a little bit more liberal, the incumbent Randy Wagner was very strong feminist, very good president in the meantime, in my opinion, but she was challenged by a kind of Danish type of former interior minister, not so friendly to migration, and then subsequently a more lefty person who eventually won the election, even if first time they couldn't count the vote properly, and they announced Mr. Doskotil to be the leader. But then it was Andreas Babler who took over, but they don't eat each other. They don't exclude each other. They don't kick each other over the table, under the table, but maintain party unity because they know that the only way to go forward is to have a big tent. So even if the tent is a little bit shrinking because of the erosion, which we both spoke about, that you need to maintain a big tent approach in order to have a viable progressive alternative in any country, east, west, or center.
Okay, before they come and take our furniture away, our time is out, and I'm glad to notice that maybe the Social Democrats have failed at a lot of things, but they still like to talk a lot. So we could continue this, I think, endlessly, maybe, and we will, I'm sure, because the questions are still up in the air. But this session we have to finish at this point. So I would like to, first of all, thank the two contributors to the panel for today. Ernst, thank you, and László, thank you very much. I think they deserve. I would also like to thank all of you for coming along today. I'd like to thank the interpreters. I'd like to thank the technical staff and Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for supporting the entire series this semester, which consisted of a lot of different topics, and especially Gábor Péter for organizing all of these sessions throughout the semester. See you next week, next year. Sorry, not next week, next year. Merry Christmas to everybody.